Well, hello everyone. Welcome to a live stream History Valley podcast. And today I am joined by Professor Shelly Matthews. Shelly Matthews holds a Doctor of Theology degree from the Harvard Divinity School, a Master's of Divinity from Boston University School of Theology, and a Bachelor's of Arts from the University of North Dakota. Her recent publications include a co-authored 2-volume feminist commentary on the Gospel of Luke, Liturgical Press 2021, a subject which she eagerly engages in public lectures and workshops. She is currently working on a book-length feminist guide to early Christian resurrection. She is the series editor for the SBL Press series Early Christianity and its Literature, and was the co-founder and inaugural co-chair with Tatsiang Benny Liu of the Society of Biblical Literature Program Unit on Racism, Pedagogy, and Biblical Studies, before arriving at Brite in 2011. She was a Dorothy and BHP's Junior Associate Professor of Religion at Furman University in Greenville, South Carolina, where she taught for 13 years. She's an ordained United Methodist minister at Dakotas Area Conference. And today's discussion is based upon her book titled The Acts of the Apostles, Taming the Tongues of Fire. And that being said, welcome to the History Valley podcast, Professor Matthews.
Hello, nice to be here.
Thank you for being here today. So I'd like to get right into it. Does the Book of Acts provide us with reliable information on Paul the Apostle and the many other characters that it talks about?
Okay. And I would have to come back and say, what do you mean reliable? You mean, is this historically accurate, like a journalist or historian? Yeah, I mean, I would just say that if by reliable you mean, is Luke a journalist, or is Luke answer is no. Of course, Luke believes and makes a case that his writings are reliable in that they are reassuring to his patron Theophilus. But that is, I just would say that ancients thought about literature differently than modern biblical fundamentalists. And so the concern with accurate history is not theirs as it is ours. And the question of how you make something reliable is also different.
So what kind of narrative is Luke trying to craft in Acts? Does he appear to be blending historically accurate information with fictional, mythological information? And if so, for what purpose?
Yeah, historical versus fictional. I mean, I would say the purpose is, and I always go to Luke and the preface, which I think that is the gospel preface, I think is also guiding the book of Acts as well. Luke wants to reassure Theophilus about the things that have happened in his midst concerning Jesus and the apostles. I guess it's not history versus fiction is not the way the ancients thought about it. I mean, I would say that maybe I'll make this distinction, and this is a distinction in classical rhetoric. It goes back to Cicero, that so when you're writing history, you have a lot of freedom to craft your narrative, right? But there are certain things you can't, that are so well known, or certain things that are part of the tradition that you can't mess with those. So, for instance, I would say that Jesus is crucified, and Luke is not going to tell you that Jesus committed suicide, right? That's the fact on the ground. Peter betrayed Jesus. Luke knows that story. He can't say that Peter did not betray Jesus, but he can create a very, I would say, ingenious narrative in which Jesus in the Gospel of Luke tells Peter that he's going to fail, but it's because Satan is testing him, and et cetera, et cetera. So it's not so much history versus fiction as there are reliable elements that belong to the storyline that you cannot change. And I think, for instance, Paul is a real person. Paul is not mythological or fictional. I think the apostles traveled to preach the gospel, that Jesus was crucified also as a historical person. But Luke has plenty of leeway in how he puts those details together, and that's the freedom of the author of histories, who were understood their work as needing to edify and perhaps also to entertain. But again, the ancients did not have recourse. It's hard to imagine their lives, how you would write a history without a tape recorder or without archives or without, the many things that modern historians and journalists rely on. But ancient historians knew they didn't have exact speeches from people. And that's also a famous quip Thucydides, the ancient Greek historian, about speeches that, you might not have or you don't have the actual words of a speech given by this general or that statesman, but you should craft them as you imagine that general would speak, right? And it does also seem in the book of Acts, which is full of speeches, that those are not tape recordings of things Luke heard, or, scribes were not, handwriting as the speeches were being delivered as we now see it in courtrooms. But those are crafted by Luke in ways that he would want the story to be told. And then with respect to Paul, I think that Luke has a lot of freedom, and that the direction in which Luke alters the story of Paul is to make him more heroic, stronger, a great orator on the stage. And these are things that we don't think Paul, the author of the epistles, actually was. I've said it in other forums that Luke is engaging in a bit of fan fiction, making Paul a little bit like, for instance, we could say a little bit like the Energizer Bunny, right? He just keeps going, he gets stoned, drops over, gets up again, and goes to his next stop without needing to catch breath. At the end of the narrative, he's essentially takes over the piloting of a ship from the captain. And, that's the stuff, I would say, of comic books in our day, not the work of a historian or a biographer. So, but I would still say that Luke does not see himself as deceiving people or as destroying people's faith, but as constructing a reliable narrative on his terms, in his quest to reassure Theophilus and spread the gospel.
We have a super chat question from JC. Thank you for your super chat. Any hypotheses regarding the crocus rosettas on the Magdala stone and the talpiot ossuary Jesus? Was crocus as reproduction considered miraculous? Thank you for that super chat question, but it's off topic and it's not about Acts.
Good, and I wouldn't. Good.
Sorry about that, JC. But speaking on speeches, so when you see something like Gamaliel's speech in Acts of the Apostles, he's talking about, there was that guy called Judas. He got defeated, and there was Judas the Galilean. He got defeated too, and something like that. And when you look at something like that, like, how do you tell? How does a historian tell when a speech is fake from when it's real? Because is it possible that Acts may have interviewed somebody that heard that speech, or how does that work?
Yeah, no, again, and your categories, history versus fiction, fake versus real, reliable versus, made up. Again, these are not the way those people think, the historians think. Imagine yourself, someone listening to this, transcribing not even transcribing my words. Well, I guess, let's say you're a literate scribe and you're transcribing my words, word for word, and you were able to preserve them for 40 years and hand them to someone. Again, that's just such a, this is what Shelly Matthews said. This is what Gamaliel said. And again, that goes into questions of dating. It's one of the reasons that more conserving scholars want to date Acts early, because, well, sure, someone could remember a conversation like that, 10 years later. But I am also one who understands Acts as a second century work, and in the spirit of ancient historians, even though Luke is not a historian himself, but something like a historian. He is freely attributing dialogue to his characters. That is not historical. And maybe that sounds radical, but that's a pretty, I want to say, commonplace in narrative studies of biblical literature. Of course, there are the famous historical Jesus scholars who try to, dig down to the historical words that Jesus actually said. But even if they claim that some of it is historical, most would concede that a good bit of gospel tradition or speeches attributed to Jesus are composed later, right, from other sources. And that's certainly the case with the book of Acts.
Speaking of dating the book of Acts to the 2nd century CE, what do you make of Luke Acts using Josephus? Do you believe that Luke Acts knew Josephus? And if so, what would you say the implications of that is?
Oh, well, I have been convinced by those who argue that if you look particularly at the book of Acts, but possibly even in passages in Luke, that Luke seems to know particular details as preserved by Josephus. You mentioned that Gamaliel speech, which is about Judas the Galilean. If you flip me to exactly where that is in Acts, I could take a look at it. But it's the way that incident is described, or isn't that also the Egyptian and Judas the Galilean, and how those their fates? Those are the fates described roughly for them in the book of in Josephus's Antiquities. I would also say that there is more and more appreciation of
Acts 5:34-49.
Oh, thank you. Yes. But I would also say, as I flip just quickly to remind myself of that passage, which I haven't thought about for a long time, I would also say there's just been a lot more work on ancient literacy, ancient writing, ancient authors, and more awareness that if you were writing in Greek, you were educated in a certain way, right? We have some of the grammars that seem to be the sorts of exercise books by which people learned how to write. But so you have common education practices, and also small groups of literate people, cultural producers who moved in circles with other cultural producers. And so, I think the case gets stronger and stronger that if Luke is writing as late as I think Luke is, and if Luke, is an educated person, which I also think he is, the most educated of the gospel authors in terms of his rhetorical skill, it makes sense then that he availed himself to recent readings that or recent authors that covered events that are of concern to him. So yeah, that's where I stand. I think this I don't know where, in terms of gauging the world of scholars, I think there are more and more people moving to this assumption that Luke knows Josephus, though I can't speak for the guild in terms of gauging the amount of consensus on that.
So does it seem like that Luke is pulling some information from Josephus, maybe from some other sources we don't have, because he's trying to put together what he thinks is a more cohesive, colorful narrative of Paul's life? Because I know that some argue about Acts doesn't know Paul's letters.
Right.
What is your position on that?
Oh yeah, no, I follow those who, it used to be that the reason people said that Luke did not know Paul's letters is that he often presents stories differently from the way that Paul recounts them. And so that used to lead to the conclusion that, well, if he had the letters of Paul, he would follow them rotely, right? And would, be recording information in precisely the same way. But there is now more recognition, going back to what I said earlier, that historians had some freedom, a good bit of freedom in how they crafted their story. And so if there are places where the letters of Paul and Acts contradict, that is, that doesn't make it impossible to imagine that Luke knows the letters. He's just using them freely. So again, because I see Luke also as a second century text, it makes sense to me that he is aware of Pauline letters. Sometimes his stories do line up, but many ways in which they don't are, again, I think, owing to the fact that Luke wants to elevate Paul more than Paul. Paul is in his letters deprecating. The classic place where this is illustrated, and this has been noted for more than 100 years by biblical scholars, that Paul in his letters stresses suffering, humiliation, his own weakness. And there's a classic line in 2 Corinthians where he agrees that his speech is contemptible and his bodily presence is weak. Whereas in Acts, Paul is not weak. His speech is not contemptible, right? He's a raider of high standing. He's very strong. There's no sense that he has an infirmity. So again, just back to one of the classic ways that the Paul of Acts differs from the Paul of the epistles. They used to talk about that as the difference between the theology of the cross emphasized by Paul and the theology of glory emphasized by Luke. We have different ways to speak about that now, but again, Luke's job, as he sees it, is to elevate Paul and the movement. And so in order to persuade. So why would he tell stories of Paul that are unbecoming, or of the movement that would dissuade people or turn them off?
So do you think that when he went through Paul's letters, he felt them to be a bit lackluster, and he wanted to create a narrative to make Paul better in his eyes?
Well, I don't know about lackluster. I guess I don't know that I would say lackluster, but yeah, better. I would say certainly stronger. Certainly without emphasizing any physical ailments. Certainly emphasizing that Paul is an orator. There are so many speeches in the book of Acts, and I've written on that in that book you mentioned, the Taming the Tongues of Fire book, that in the ancient world, speeches were understood. The famous classicist Maud Gleason calls them the calisthenics of manhood. That is, public speaking was thought of as physically very exerting, and that you had to be strong to be an orator. You had to train, to manage the robes and the heavy robes and the jeers from the crowd and all. So I would say better. I would say that Luke makes Paul better by making him stronger, by making him a skilled orator, something that Paul himself does not claim for himself. I would say Luke also makes Paul better by claiming he's a Roman citizen and a citizen of Tarsus and a student at the feet of Gamaliel, a Pharisee at the feet of Gamaliel. The question of whether Paul is a Roman citizen is often debated among biblical scholars. Paul himself never says, I'm a Roman citizen, and the ways it occurs in the Acts of the Apostles suggests that it's a literary device used by Luke. That's the question that's often debated. Was Paul a Roman citizen? But in Acts, not only is a Roman citizen, he is a citizen of the city of Tarsus. That's different than our own understanding of citizenship, at least if in the U.S., right, you're a citizen of a country. In the ancient world, you could be both a citizen, of the empire, a Roman citizen, and a citizen of a city. Being a citizen of a preeminent city was also a sign of prestige, but it also was a sign of you're willing to engage in, I guess, what we would call syncretism, because if you were a citizen of the city, you would have to be involved in sacrifices to the gods. So Paul claiming, I'm a citizen of Tarsus, I'm a citizen of Rome, and I was studied at the feet of Gamaliel. Again, I attribute that to the fan fiction element of Acts, or the fictional or comic book sort of side of it. It strains credulity, I have argued, to imagine that Paul is both a citizen of Rome and a Pharisee at the feet of Gamaliel and a citizen of Tarsus. That's just too many good things, and also contradictory things. So yeah, Luke is interested in making Paul better. That's a good way to say it.
And wouldn't one think that if he really was taught by Gamaliel, that he would have boasted about that and say something like the letter to the Philippians when he says that he's a Hebrew of Hebrews?
Yeah, and again, that might be an example of where where Luke has some familiarity with Paul's self-descriptions. He was, especially in the letter to the Philippians, he gives a bit of biographical statement, right? Tribe of Benjamin, Hebrew of the Hebrews, and Luke, that might have inspired Luke to say, well, how can I underscore that? Let me make him a disciple of Gamaliel, which is a perfectly acceptable way under the constraints that Luke writes. That's not deceit or lying. That's just my job, is to show how great Paul is. I see here in Paul's letter that he calls himself the Hebrew tribe of Benjamin. Let me, emphasize that let me crystallize that by associating him with Gamaliel.
And do you think that to a certain degree that Luke is using the text of Josephus, he's getting some inspiration from Josephus on how he wants to embellish the historical Paul?
Oh, yeah. I don't know. I don't know that the inspiration on how to embellish Paul, I don't know that has to come from Josephus directly. It's just part of what writing history is. So I don't think that has to be direct from Josephus. And right, Josephus doesn't mention Paul, but certainly in the way, there's something in common, and it's often been noted that both, Josephus is writing certainly the Antiquities to put the best light that he can on his people, right? So it's an apologetic piece of literature, if we can still use that term. And so in that way, Luke Acts shares with Josephus this idea that I'm writing history to embellish my people and find them a place within a safe space, if you will, within the Roman world. But others were doing that as well. There are other Jewish apologists. There are, Polybius is often cited. Lucian is another, this Lucian the Syrian, also sort of this educated cultural producer trying to make his way in Rome. So that particular mode of thinking about his writing does not necessarily come from Josephus. It's just a common way to write history, or to defend your people, if you will, or to elevate your group in an empire where there are competing groups and competing ideas of valor.
What do you make of this section that some scholars talk about, the we section of Acts, or the we document? Some postulate that there was such a thing, and that the author of Acts kind of spliced them together.
Right. The we section of Acts is was earliest accounted for or understood as evidence that Luke was a companion of Paul, right? And that is, when the early fathers start to identify authorship in the New Testament or authorship of the Gospels, which is not until 180 in Irenaeus. Then the tradition is that Luke is Paul's companion, and therefore that the we is, part of his autobiographical journaling. Again, since I am not persuaded that Luke was written by a companion of Paul, which would make it a document of what, 60s or 70s, maybe he was a very young companion of Paul, maybe the 80s. But I see that also as a literary device, to bring the audience into the action. I think it's Vern Robbins has, an article on the we passages in Acts, which seems to make more sense to me than a notion of that Acts, that the author of Luke works from a we source or is the we source. That was the original way to think about it, is that's Luke's biographical reflection on his travels with Paul.
Does Acts kind of remind you to a degree of Greco-Roman travel narratives?
The periploy, the sailing narratives or whatever. Certainly there have been observations that some pieces of Acts, the close journaling, especially towards the end when they're going from Miletus back to Jerusalem. We sailed into this port, and we, there's sort of a diary aspect to it that does sound like some of the what did you call them? The travel journals, the sailing
travel narratives.
Yeah, the travel narratives or sailing narratives. So there might be a bit of that because of, again, those very last passages in Acts that tell of Paul's return to Jerusalem. There seems to be a concern about where the nautical ports are and where we sailed and on what day. Just as an aside, there's I think a very interesting article by John Kloppenborg on geography in Acts that argues that when Luke is talking about the inland, certainly the Galilee, Samaria, he gets, his geography is confused. But when he starts laying out the Levant, the coastline there, he seems to know the cities, how long it would have been to travel, and suggests that he has access to one of these large ancient maps of the coastline, so that he can make, can plot that part of the book accurately. And I find that interesting because it's really nice to think that, we know of we can just get into Luke's brain a little bit to know, what his sources were. But rather than the travel narratives, I think in other ways, Luke matches up more with Hellenistic novels, unless that's what you meant. The Hellenistic novels or the Greek novel has common elements with the book of Acts, and then also the apocryphal Acts in that the travel, that the adventure moves around the Mediterranean world. Just again, to cite another scholar, Loveday Alexander, who's worked on the mapping of the Acts of the Apostles. And the apocryphal Acts notes, if you map, the travel narrative in some of these Acts on top of the journeys of Paul and Acts, you see a lot of overlap in terms of which cities are landed in. So I think Luke has some awareness of that genre as well.
Some argue that, hey, Acts never mentions Paul's death. And so therefore it was written before his death.
Right. That's another, for those who date Paul early, it's not unlike, because Luke does not accurately reflect the letters, he must not know the letters. because, there's argument that because Acts does not tell of Paul's death, therefore it must be written before Paul died, because of course if he knew about the death, he would tell of the death. There's a couple arguments I would make against that. First of all, in his farewell speech in Miletus, is that Acts 20 or Acts? Yeah, it is Acts 20. The death is clearly foreshadowed. There will be this time when I won't be here, blah, 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 and the sheep among the wolves. And so, it seems to me that the readers of Luke, as well as Luke himself, read this speech knowing that Paul has died. And then another thing I would say is that Luke is caught in a bit of a dilemma in terms of Paul's death, because as the tradition has it, and I see no reason to dispute it, Paul is killed, as a martyr of some kind by Romans. And in Luke's telling, the primary killers are Jews that don't believe in the movement. The Romans sometimes aid and abet that. But that's a piece where, I think if Paul could, if Luke had even more freedom and wasn't bound by the details that, are such common knowledge that he can't change them, I would argue that he would like to say, Paul is killed by the Jews. There's a place where Paul says, I'm ready to die in Jerusalem, meaning he's ready to follow in the footsteps of Jesus and die in Jerusalem, which would, of course, be the capital of Judea. But he can't do that. So instead, he leaves the death unaccounted. And that marvelous ending that Paul is under house arrest and is able to preach unhindered. Luke was brilliant. I'll just say that. But go ahead.
So when you see contradictions between Acts and Paul's letters, the typical route would be to say that Paul's epistles would have to be, like when you're in a situation where something that Acts says contradicts something that Paul says, you have to prioritize what Paul says over Acts.
Yes, yes, that's what I try as hard as I can to only base anything I say about the historical Paul on Paul's letters, just because I regard Luke as doing something else than provide in the modern sense of the word history. So yeah, when I think about Paul, I only think of the letters. That is not common in biblical scholarship. I would argue that people reflexively, especially if they're not Acts scholars, it is common to reflexively, if you need a piece of data and you can't find it in Paul or you can't find it in Josephus, you just grab from Acts and assume that that's historical data. But I'm not in that school of thought.
I would like to talk about the martyrdom of Stephen, because
yes,
the circumstances of Stephen's death has raised doubts about what Acts is saying about the story of Stephen. He's supposedly this first Gentile convert who gets executed by the Sanhedrin.
The Sanhedrin, yeah. And I don't know, he's not a Gentile, is he? I don't think he's a Gentile convert. I'm just, Stephen is full of grace. He's one of the deacons, right? The Hellenist and the Hebrew.
Maybe I mixed him up with a different character.
Yeah, no, I would assume he's still a Jew, but he is killed by Jews. He's a diaspora Jew. Thank you. This was my, I would draw here from my 2011 book entitled Perfect Martyr, in which I situate the stoning of Stephen and my understanding of what's going on in Acts. I argue that Stephen is a perfect martyr in a couple different ways. One of which, to answer your question, is that he is rhetorically perfect. I would, if I had to bet, and I don't have to bet, but he seems fictional to me. Acts is free to invent fictional characters. And the name Stephen in Greek, Stephanos, literally means crown. And as early Christians developed a tradition of martyrdom, they understood that the martyrs are those who receive the crown, right? The crown of glory. And so saying that Stephanos was martyred or was stoned by the Jews is not unlike speaking of Abraham as eponymous, right? Abraham just means father of the nation, right? So that in biblical times and in biblical narratives, it is common to construct symbolic characters. And a clue to that is if their names have a symbolic ring to them, as Stephanos does. Also, more of the perfectness of it is, this comes back to this question of Luke wants to cite Jewish non-believers as the primary enemies of the way. They are the ones who, argue for Jesus to be crucified. But in the Jesus story, Luke has freedom to narrate and elevate the role of the Jews in Jesus's death, but he can't get around the crucifixion being Rome, right? He can't say that the Jews stoned Jesus, but with Stephen, an invented character, he can tell a story of how it is the Jews who, drag him out of the city and stone him, with Paul looking on. So that's part of my argument. What are your questions about it?
Yeah, I think I did mix them up with a different Gentile martyrdom story or something like that. Yeah, he's not a Gentile.
Yes.
That's my mistake. But yeah, I do find it interesting. It says that Saul approved of his death.
Right.
What do you think that's about? Are they trying to embellish the story of Saul as the persecutor, perhaps?
Well, it is, Saul approved of the killing, right? And the people who stone Stephen lay their coats at the feet of Saul. Yeah, I mean, there's a point where it would be nice to have more information than we do. Paul, in his own letter, particularly in Galatians 2, which is the most autobiographical he gets, aside from that Philippians quote, where he says that he in his former life, right, in Judaism, he persecuted the ecclesia to the utmost. And there are questions, and I think I was paraphrasing there. I just have an NRSV. Yes, here we are. You have heard, no doubt, and I should have the Greek right in front of me, my life in Judaism, right? And Judaismos. I was violently persecuting the church of God and was trying to destroy it, right? So that's what Paul says of himself. And what we don't know is, what did that violence entail? And there, because, did he whip people? Did he participate in a stoning or two? What is it? Violently, I was trying to destroy the church. How do you destroy the church? Well, I don't know. Do you throw rocks at a building in which Jesus people are meeting? He doesn't embellish that. Luke decides to depict Paul before he converts, if you will, in his Jewish life, right, or in his non-follower of the way life, as breathing threats and murder against the followers of the way, right? And so in Stephen, he's not actually murdering, but he's around, which is, another way to get him in this. He's breathing threats and murder. So that, Acts definitely, and then of course the tables turn. Once the road to Damascus experience happens, then Paul shifts from persecutor to being persecuted immediately after, right? It starts as soon as he's converted in Damascus. The Jews then start to kill him or try to kill him. It would be great to have a more specific understanding of what Paul means when he says violently, trying to destroy it. There is a tradition in the Pseudo-Clementines, which is an extra canonical tradition of that highlights James and also Peter, but there Paul is accused of being a murderer. So there are different ways the question of how violent Paul was is answered. There is, I can't pull the chapter and verse off the top of my head, but in one of Paul's speeches, he says, "I am innocent of the blood of all of you." And, that's a question. Why does he have to say that? Why does he have to say, "I'm innocent of the blood of all of you"? Is it because he has been accused of not being innocent in bloodshed? We don't know, but it's out there in the air, and Acts takes those accusations and sort of curbs them in. He was violent, but he wasn't the stoner, right? He breathes threats and murder. That's the description of him, as he's going around. But that's different than murdering.
So when you see that in Acts, when Paul, he sees Peter, he sees James, and they seem to be getting along in Acts, but in Galatians, they're not getting along. So
Right.
is this an example of Acts trying to fix problems that the historical Paul has? It, everybody's getting along, there's no problem here.
Yes, no, exactly. That is, as I would see, and I don't think I'm out on a limb on this point, that Acts tries to harmonize Peter and Paul. And that, as the church goes along, you start to see images of Peter and Paul hugging, right? Or shaking hands or whatever. So the church, as it coalesces, the Orthodox Church, around a set of scriptures, Peter and Paul are harmonized, right? The New Testament includes all of those writings from Paul, but also some writings from Peter, pseudonymous. But yeah, Peter and Paul come together. And that's as early as the early 2nd century. In the apostolic epistles, there are references to Peter and Paul as buddies, but you don't see that in Galatians so much.
And when you look at this shipwreck story in Acts, when he shipwrecks at the Adriatic Sea, the ship size is described, how many people were on board, so we're given a bit of information there. And you compare that to what Paul says in 2 Corinthians, when he says that he was shipwrecked 3 times, but doesn't tell us much about any of those shipwrecks at all. He just says he was shipwrecked 3 times. When you compare what Paul says in 2 Corinthians about him allegedly having 3 shipwrecks in the past, but what Acts says about that one shipwreck at the Adriatic Sea, what do you make of that? Do you think Acts is just could it be talking about one of the 3 shipwrecks that Paul had, or is Acts making that up?
Oh, Acts is making that up. I mean, but again, the inspiration for it might have been reading Paul saying he was shipwrecked. Well, that's interesting. Let me tell his shipwreck story. I mean, at least the details of it are clearly Lucan embellishment, again, and in comic book fashion. I don't know what else to compare it to for modern listeners, but right, Paul, you forget Paul is a prisoner, right? He's going to Rome in chains, I suppose. But as the shipwreck story is told, right? I mean, Paul, administers the Eucharist, if you will. Paul is able to direct the ship. He becomes an astute sailor, right? I mean, he takes over. He's not the prisoner. He's the hero of the shipwreck. And it reads like a story of a hero, who has miraculous powers and protection by God. And also, just chronology wise, in 2 Corinthians, I've been shipwrecked 3 times, that list of hardships. He isn't in Rome away, under house arrest at that time, right? The shipwreck is the last scene. And others have also noted how it makes sense in terms of the ancient novel, right? Ancient novels always have shipwrecks, and this scene, rings clear, or alludes to that sort of adventure. The dialogue, the interactions, the deference of the centurions and the captain to Paul. Again, he's a prisoner, at least as Christian tradition goes, he's killed by the Romans, but here he is, their savior and superior.
Right. So Acts cannot be talking about any one of those 3 shipwrecks. So if one were to believe that the Adriatic Sea shipwreck event in Acts is historical, then you would have to call that the 4th shipwreck.
Well, I guess. Or, if you were adding them all up and all you used was, the epistles and the book of Acts, that's what you would have to say. But I don't say that.
I think what could be an example of what I meant earlier, like I wasn't trying to say earlier when I was asking about was Luke somewhat, I wasn't saying he was completely inspired, but partially inspired from what he read in Josephus. And Josephus may not mention Paul, but he was just going for details. Josephus was like, oh, okay, that gave me an idea or two. I can embellish Paul. So I wonder if you think that one example of this is the Egyptian false prophet that Josephus and Acts both mention, the Egyptian rebel who led an army.
Yes, that I do think is a place where the author of Acts has read Josephus. The details are changed a bit, but yeah, I would, that for those who think that Paul knows Josephus, that's one of the places that is pointed to because of the specifics of the stories and the characteristic of the protagonists, or I should say antagonists, who are these rabble rousers. I would say, another place I think that Luke follows Josephus is in his description of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, right? In terms of the Pharisees believing in the resurrection and the Sadducees not. That's a point that is underscored in Josephus, and Luke seems to rely on these descriptions when he's talking about those parties, if you will.
Yeah, because he has Paul running around, and he gets confused with the Egyptian by some Roman commander, Claudius Lysias, who briefly thinks that Paul is the Egyptian, and then realizes, oh, that's a mistake. You're free to go.
Right, and you're not only you're not an Egyptian, but you're a Roman citizen. No, so that's Acts. What else do you have? Or
we have a couple of audience questions. I'll get to them in a second. But yeah, does it seem like that the Egyptian was probably an Egyptian-born Jew that was a Jew that was born in Egypt, that was leading some kind of rebellion?
Yeah, and again, I'm sorry, I just don't have a lot of this stuff on the top of my head right now. But yeah, because I think when Josephus speaks, he's assuming all of these rebels are Jewish, right? Jewish rebels, right. I don't have the text in front of me right now. But yeah, there's the Egyptian and that unnamed prophet, right? They all sort of enact Exodus-like or Passover-like elements and get plowed over by the Romans.
So I see another super chat from JC. But JC, I can already see it's off topic. Those who seek saffron find it early, EOS above. But thank you for the super chat anyway. Now this one here, this question I don't think is as off topic, but it could be potentially. Michael Fuller, thank you for your question. Would Acts have been just as authoritative as a work like the Acts of Paul and Thecla in the 2nd century?
Yeah, that's a good question. And as authoritative, I mean, a couple ways to answer that are to say it would depend on the community. I mean, the first instance where we have someone using Acts as an authority, like this is an authoritative work and I'm going to prove my points by quoting it, that's Irenaeus in 180 of the Common Era, so late 2nd century, as he writes his works against heresy, right? So for Irenaeus in 180 BCE, Acts is an authoritative work, but we don't have earlier fathers like, authors like Justin, for instance, who's the obvious church father earlier than Irenaeus, does not refer to the book of Acts. Now, in terms of authoritativeness, I don't know about the Acts of Paul and Thecla as authoritative or how widely so. It does seem to have been popular, widely read. The Acts of the Acts of Paul and all of the Acts of the Apostles, we assume because of the multiple versions, multiple manuscripts, that those were widely read. They're more, they're entertaining. And so I guess that's, an issue of enjoyment. Now it is Tertullian, early 3rd century, who steps down or, attempts to diminish the Acts of Paul by arguing that it's not authentic. It was written by a presbyter and therefore women shouldn't baptize, yada, yada. So we can see clearly a direction where the Acts of Paul is not going to be incorporated, widely as scripture, the way that Acts comes to be. But in the 2nd century, particularly in the beginning of the 2nd century, things are open. And I guess at the beginning of the 2nd century, neither are written. But yeah, authority has not yet been fixed in the 2nd century. At least of these more supplementary books. You can see some coalescing around letters of Paul, and you can see some coalescing around a fourfold gospel, but Acts is not cited authoritatively. I'll also say in the question of history, Eusebius does draw from Acts quite a bit in his church history, but it is interesting to note that Eusebius doesn't refer to Acts as a history. Because he is writing the first church history. Anyway, that's more than he wanted, but
That was muted. DMG, thank you for your question.
Yes.
How did people like Paul, who claimed to be a Roman citizen, show evidence of this claim to the Roman authorities? Did they have some sort of permit or letter?
That is a great question, and that brings up the conversation we had earlier. I would say that, again, it's not Paul who claims to be a Roman citizen. It's Luke. I mean, he puts those words into Paul's mouth, but Luke is the one who claims that Paul is a Roman citizen. But it's very interesting, and that's why it seems to be more to generate the narrative than to reflect a historical fact, is that the first time that Paul claims he's a Roman citizen, according to Luke, in the book of Acts, is in Acts 16, after he spent a night in jail in Philippi. Then, the jailers or magistrates, I can't remember which authorities, want to beat him. And he says, oh, sure, you're going to beat a Roman citizen. And then they immediately back away because they find, well, we're not going to beat a Roman citizen. But the reason that is seems to be a narrative plot than a reflection of Paul's historical citizenship is technically, if he had pointed out his Roman citizenship the night before to the jailers, then they wouldn't have jailed him, right? Or beaten him and put him in jail. So it seems like bad timing and therefore fantastical rather than historical. Now, I will say in the book of Acts, where the citizenship claims are made, Paul never takes out a stamp, right? He just says it. So according to Acts, it's a mere word of mouth declaration that is immediately believed. Right? There's no one, like, he's talking. Who is it he's talking to in jail? I'm sorry, I should have just refreshed my memory. It's not the tribune himself. It's just a Roman guard who says he is a citizen. They both agree that they're citizens, and Paul says he's natural born. It's a citizenship that's natural, not purchased. But again, these are just two guys, claiming Roman citizenship. But for the book of Acts, the word of mouth is all that's needed to move the story along. In actuality, are there permits or letters? I mean, it seems to me there has to be proof of some kind beyond just your own claim that you are. But it's not a topic I've looked into. I will only note that in the book of Acts, there is no, and Paul pulled out his permit to prove his citizenship. He doesn't ever say that, right? He just claims it, and then the story churns. But it's a good question. If you find the answer, let me know. I'm sure someone has written on it. I mean, it's obviously something people write about.
John Johnson, thank you for your question. Didn't Josephus travel to the same places as Paul? Seems exactly, really.
Yeah, I wouldn't say exactly. And certainly Josephus knows the Galilee, right? He's a soldier in the Jewish war in the Galilee, where we think that Paul never traveled. I don't think he's traveled to the Galilee, or at least there's no story of him traveling there. And do we have Josephus, running around the Mediterranean, stopping in Ephesus and all of that? I mean, the story of Josephus that I know is he's arrested, right, by the Romans during the Jewish war, but prophesies Vespasian is going to be the next emperor, and therefore, again, this all we have are Josephus's words. He's taken to Rome under house arrest. So I don't think he's, I don't think we have. At least I don't have the story of how Josephus goes to Rome, but he goes as a captive, so I presume on a ship. So I would say no, it's not exactly the same. Although I'm curious to know how you came to this question. It seems exactly. I'm wondering what you're thinking of. Again, Josephus ends his life in Rome. We don't know how. Speculation that he might be eventually killed by the emperors who he loses favor with, but there's no story of his death.
Yeah, that would have been Domitian, because he kind of turned on other Flavians in his family, and supposedly, I mean, depending, some think it's not historical, some think it is. That is the Messianic persecution of Christians.
Right.
But that's a whole nother story.
That is another story.
I would like to ask you my closing question. When you look at Acts in general and you compare it to Luke's gospel, how does the narrative differ? What is the differences between what Luke is doing with his gospel versus what he's done with Acts?
Well, yeah. I mean, I guess the obvious thing is that the gospel is about Jesus, right? Starts in the Galilee and goes to Jerusalem. Acts is about the apostles going from Jerusalem to Rome, right? So it's that two-part thing. Some have, argued this is a, biography of the hero plus his successors. I mean, a couple things to say is that Luke is constrained by the gospel tradition. I think he uses Mark. Some say he uses Matthew. I'm not in that camp. I still just think Luke, that he's using Mark and the synoptics. So therefore he has, I would say, more constraints on his narrative when he's following the gospel, because he's got this tradition he's got to follow. Whereas with Acts, he's able to have more free form, because he's the only author who takes up this question of, well, what happened after Jesus died, and turns it into history or hysteria, or whatever we want to call it. So he's got, I think they're linked. I think they're related projects, but, the scope is quite different. Because he's got more, and therefore he has more freedom with how he sculpts the second book as opposed to the first. It's interesting. I mean, again, all the things we don't know, it would be though we can talk about Luke Acts, and I talk about Luke Acts, and I think he's got, that there's some parts of this 2-volume work where it seems to me he's, outlined some of Acts even as he's writing Luke. That is, the trial of Jesus in Luke includes some of the details in Mark, but he reserves others of them for the story of Stephen, right? So he's got a lot, and he's switching it around. There are people who want to argue Acts is a totally different author. I'm not in that camp, but yes, back to the puzzle is there are no ancient manuscripts of Luke and Acts bound together, right? If you have a Gospel of Luke bound to something, it's bound to the Gospels. If you have Acts, oddly enough, it's bound to, I want to say, the Catholic epistles. So even though we study them together, assume the same authorship, we just don't see a place, we have, at least not extant, where a bookseller or a book publisher, bound them together.
DMG says, thank you for your reply to my question. It clarified the probable reality of the aim of the narrative.
Okay. Thanks, DMG.
Floppy and Fun Bogan says, when I was a fundamentalist Baptist, all I heard was how Luke was the most reliable and greatest historian ever.
Yes, that would make sense, because in fundamentalist Baptistness, which is, of course, our other kinds of Baptists, right? This, it's got to be literal. If it's word for word, literally true, and literally true means it really happened exactly how he said it. So of course that would be said. And again, it would turn on what you mean by reliable. I think he's got a solid story. I think he's a brilliant author, and imaginative and ingenious the way, because he's got these, he's got a goal that he has, but he's got these traditions that he can't, deny, and he's got to weave it all together. But greatest historian ever in terms of, accurately conveying what actually happened. I just think that's a modern understanding of what history was. I mean, you can call him the greatest historian ever. I would say, if you're thinking of influence, I think, that Luke and Acts are highly influential. That Acts, just because it's narrative, there's only one of them. I do think that it's embedded in Western consciousness that this is how it happened. So, full, probably, right? Most well known. But that he got all the facts exactly right, and that's all he cared about, that's foreign to the way ancients talked. Do I have one more minute, or are we ready to go?
Oh, no, it's fine.
I just want to give you one example of the differences between ancient historians and our own. And I show this sometimes to my students. Josephus, in his preface to the Antiquities, which begins with a retelling of Genesis, goes through the whole biblical history and then up to Roman times. In his preface, he says, okay, I'm going to tell the story of the Jews in our life, and I am not going to add any details, and I'm not going to just subtract any details. I'm paraphrasing, right? I'm just going to tell you exactly what happened. It's essentially what Josephus says. And with his retelling of biblical matters, we can check, right? We have the Bible. And it is actually the case that Josephus adds and subtracts all over the place. I mean, just one example is that, he's got Moses riding off to Egypt on a horse, and gets his bride there and, battles people. None of this is told in the Bible, in the biblical narrative. But it's just, it's a puzzle that Josephus, I don't think he's lying, but what he means by I've not added anything, I've not subtracted anything, it doesn't it doesn't mean what a modern historian would say when, relating a history. They have different categories and different ways of understanding what a narrative should do. So I certainly understand why you were taught this, because in fundamentalist Baptist teaching, of course, that's how it has to be. But I don't know, those of us who have been introduced to ancient historians and how they think, and ancient, authors and how they think, it's a hard assertion to stand up.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Professor Shelly Matthews.
Thank you, Jacob. Okay.
Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and/or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.